Welcome to the second lecture of social psychology. Today we'll be continuing with the social psychology research methods. And the intriguing question for today is, how might the choice of research method affect the type of information you get from the research? And alternately, turning that around, how might the topic of research influence your choice of method? After you've reviewed the text material and this lecture, you should be able to make some informed guesses about that. First, some announcements. I will be posting the In the News due dates, which vary by where you are at in the alphabet, and also some blog posting that is associated with that In the News activity. In addition, I want to point out that there's a study guide for exam number 1. You should download that from Blackboard and review it before reviewing these class lecture notes online, and also a good idea to look over that material before you read the chapter that is associated with each week. In addition, in the syllabus you will see learning objectives listed, and that's sort of the main broad issues that I would like you to take away from the course. And so if you read those and think about them now, then as you do the reading and listen to the lectures and talk with students and engage your assignments, you will aim your activities and integrate them in with those learning objectives and get more from the course. So I would, if you haven't already, ask you to review the syllabus, learning objectives as I mentioned, look at the In the News description in the syllabus. If you have any questions about that, please ask me or our teaching assistant, Nina. And the In the Class show and tell is replaced in this course with the blog segment that's described in the syllabus. There are 3 homework activities, and that is also described in the syllabus, and those are integrated into the course material as well as focused on topics that will be on the exam. So even though they're only worth 10 points, that's an important little percentage, but it also will help you do better on the exam if you engage those homework activities thoughtfully. The social psychology intervention paper is our largest and biggest assignment, both in terms of time and the amount of assignments associated with the overall project. So do read that, download the material for that and read it, and be ready to start asking questions about that fairly soon. With regards to the exams, I want to say there's no excuse for not getting a good grade on the short answer portion. And the reason for that is that the study guide includes 3 short answer possibilities, and at least one of those possibilities is going to be on the exam. So if you prepare in advance and even seek a little bit of feedback about your answer before the exam, then when you take the exam, you're more likely to get as many points as possible on that particular part. Let's continue on with the lecture material. We've already discussed several definitions of social psychology. We've covered the major theoretical perspectives and begun to look at the basic principles. Today we'll elaborate on the research methods and just spend maybe one slide talking about the broader network of knowledge and how social psychology relates to that. At the end of the first lecture, I encouraged people to apply those theoretical perspectives that we reviewed to particular research topics, such as gang violence, a husband cheating on a wife, a person having expectations about a person with an accent. And if you haven't already done that, you might think about engaging that activity and maybe having a quick email correspondence with someone in the class about how you think gang violence might be explained by the social cognitive perspective or the social learning perspective, or how a husband cheating on a wife is a social behavior that might be explained through social learning or through the evolutionary perspective. Just give that a try. You'll be asked to think about how theoretical perspectives would approach a topic throughout the course, and it's a good practice to start doing. So, some basic principles, continuing that idea that we picked up at the first lecture about interaction. one thing that is important to note is that social psychologists rarely think that shit happens. What I mean by that is social behavior is not random. Social behavior is goal-directed. The vast majority of behavior that you see in a social interaction is really directed towards some goal that the person is seeking. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. But even though you may occasionally look at a person and say, well, that was random, chances are their behavior actually has some kind of goal associated with it. And the thing that we emphasized in the first lecture is that social behavior represents a continual interaction between the characteristics of the person, his or her individuality, and the characteristics of the situation. So that combination of who that person is, what they bring to the situation, and how the situation is influencing him or her, and the reciprocal interaction between the two. Okay, and we talked about 6 different types of interaction on our first lecture. So back to the idea of goals. We can look at goals at a very specific level, very detailed level, such as, you hop in your car to go shopping, you study for a social psychology test, maybe you text someone to see if you can get a date for Saturday night. These are all kind of specific surface level goals, and they occur on a day-to-day basis. But tying those goals together, those specific goals, are broader goals that you are pursuing as a social animal. And social psychologists would identify these broad goals. As social creatures, we are definitely interested in establishing and maintaining social ties. We just cannot live alone. It is a purgatory to live alone and be isolated in life. And so people certainly differ from one individual to the next, but even the most introverted person will seek out and attempt to maintain social ties. We also want to understand ourselves and others. That is critical to helping us navigate the social world, understanding what we like, what we dislike, who we're compatible with, and understanding others. You have to be able to reasonably predict what's going to make your roommate mad, what's going to make your spouse happy, or your relationship partner annoyed, or what will please them. These are things that we need to do in order to be effective navigators of the social world. We also are aware of and we attempt to gain and maintain status. No one wants to be a loser, right? At the very least, we want the respect and admiration of our peers and our family members. Even if we're just on an equal status with them, we certainly don't want to be losing status and falling below and down into that loser category. We also are motivated to defend ourselves from aggressions, insults of various kinds, and we also extend that defense to those people we value. And last but not least, we are social species that are keen on reproducing. So we are very motivated in the broad sense to attract and retain mates and ultimately engage in the reproductive act. For our homosexual friends, we might say that this goal manifests in a desire to be with a long-term partner. Now, these broad social goals can be linked back to more specific things. So on the previous slide, we thought about going shopping, studying for an exam, these kinds of things. Well, maybe going shopping is about preparing a meal that you can invite people over for, and that helps you maintain your social ties, maybe because you've prepared a very nice meal that you're impressing your friends and you're gaining or maintaining status by virtue of the type of meal that you present to others. And maybe, just maybe, one of your guests that you've invited might be a romantic interest for you, and so that ties to other broad social goals. Now, let's shift to research methods. I told you at the first lecture that a lot of what social psychologists study appears like common sense. We are talking about the subject matter of our day-to-day existence, and as such, much of what we talk about in this class, you might say, well, my grandmother could have told me that, everybody knows, and that's common sense, and there's certain value to traditional knowledge and the experience that you accumulate through life. However, I would argue, over here on our right, we have a scientist, and she uses the methods of the scientific approach, or sometimes referred to in shorthand as empiricism. And we'll talk more about what that is in a moment, but what I would argue is if you want the most reliable and valid understanding of what social behavior is as general trends, then we should seek an empirical or scientific approach, and that's what the science of social psychology does. So why is Grandma's approach somewhat suspect? And we won't just pick on Grandma. We'll say that this is, generally speaking, true of human inquiry. There's three interrelated ideas here. First, we have inaccurate observation. When people are just kind of casually observing their social world, they tend to jump to conclusions. They tend to focus on things that capture their attention. They're not very systematic in the way that they go about observing the world. They just focus on things that interest them, or they focus on things that capture their attention. And sometimes they're not even very careful about observing those things. They just kind of get distracted. So we have a lot of messy or inaccurate observation of the social world, and most people base their knowledge of social behavior on that inaccurate observation. A related idea is overgeneralization. Here's where a person observes a specific example of behavior with a specific individual, or maybe a few examples from that individual or like individuals, and then assumes, overgeneralizes, to conclude that most people in situations like that would behave in a similar fashion. So, for example, if you heard from a couple of students that the stats class taught by Dr. Bachman was the worst stats class ever, it was just horribly boring and confusing, etc., you might then think, well, gee, any class that Dr. Bachman teaches, particularly stats, is going to be awful and boring, and I should avoid that. Now, it's just possible that that student you heard that information from was really not especially gifted in the mathematical reasoning department. Maybe they came into the class with a bias against statistics. Maybe they had the wrong edition of the textbook and I didn't know that and they didn't know that. There could be something peculiar about that person and their experience of the course, and yet if you think that that's true of most students who would take my class, that would be an example of inaccurate overgeneralization. People also engage in selective observation. Sometimes we call this confirmation bias, or as it notes in the parenthetical statement there, observer bias. Selective observation is the human tendency to look for what we believe to be true. So let's go back to that example of overgeneralization. You've thought, gee, you know, Dr. Bachman's stats class is going to be awful and boring and confusing. And just because of a scheduling conflict, you had to take it. And so in the first three classes, as you're watching a lecture, as you're listening, as you're going over the handouts, you keep focusing on the things that are frustrating, focusing on the things that are boring, and you don't notice the interesting examples so much, or the parts that are coming easily to you. Instead, you focus on the evidence in your observation that confirms your hunch, fits your expectations. So these are three interrelated processes that happen a lot with human inquiry about social behavior. As you're going through life, trying to learn how the social world ticks, we make these kinds of mistakes. It's been documented very well, and you'll see a number of biases mentioned in the textbook as we go through the course. Now, how does science or empiricism do it differently and do it better? Well, there are three features of the scientific method that help us more accurately observe the social world, more carefully analyze it, and come to more valid and trustworthy conclusions. So empiricism, what this means is knowledge based on facts, knowledge based on careful observations, systematic observations, not casual, what I happen to notice, what I happen to want to pay attention to, not that kind of observation, but systematic, careful observations that is done in a scientific way. So that's empiricism as opposed to hunches, opinions, beliefs, speculations. That's how a lot of people think about the social world. We also have objectivity. we strive very hard as scientists to be objective about how we interpret our observations and how we interpret our research findings. And we also have the benefit of self-correction. By that I mean, in all advances of social psychological knowledge, we go through a process called peer review. What this means is that experts, subject area experts, are there to carefully review and criticize the work of social psychology scientists. So if I conduct a research study and I make some careful observations and I collect data and analyze it and I interpret it and write that all up in a research report and then I submit it to a journal for publication, there's going to be at least 3 experts in my subject area that will carefully read my paper submission and then give feedback about how I might have misinterpreted things, how I might have been less than fully objective in my interpretation, how I might have made mistakes in my observations and methods of inquiry. Once I've corrected those things, then the paper can be published. And in some instances, the paper is observed by the experts to be so flawed that it should not be published, and then it's denied. And at good journals, the rejection rate is upwards to 80%. That means only about 20% of papers are accepted for publication. So how do social psychologists study behavior? Well, one of the ways that we advance knowledge is to start with a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis can come from a theory, and it often does, or it can be a somewhat less informed hunch about what is true of the social world. The important thing is there's a research question, which is, I'm curious about X, do boys do this differently than girls, for example. But the hypothesis is actually a prediction or an assertion about what the researcher believes to be true. So, in this case, we might say, there is a specific statement that can be falsified. That is, it's stated in a specific and detailed enough way that the evidence can be collected and the evidence may or may not support the prediction that the researcher has made. So I might say something like, in a class of elementary school students, when the teacher asks a question, boys will be more likely to speak up and raise their hand to answer that question than girls. Now then I could go to a bunch of elementary school classes and have the teacher ask the question in the same way every time, and then we could count the number of boys who raise their hand or speak up and the number of girls who do that and compare the frequencies, and maybe I find out that it's not true, that girls actually do it more often, or that it's not true that girls and boys do it equally often, or I might find that my hypothesis is actually predicted as, or is supported as predicted, that boys raise their hand and speak up more often. It's important to note here, as we were talking about research, and as you approach the material in this textbook, that research produces average tendencies, and the conclusions are about average tendencies. They're not absolutely true. They will not fit every individual. So these statistical conclusions, we make a bunch of observations, we make some mathematical calculations on those, and we have a statistical conclusion that basically says if it's significant, that means that the likelihood or the chance of this happening randomly, that more boys raise their hands than girls in this particular example, is very unlikely. It's not just a coincidence. There's actually a meaningful pattern there. So does that mean that every boy all the time will raise his hand and speak up faster than girls? No, that's not true. What we're saying in this hypothetical example is that on average, more boys will have a tendency to raise their hand and speak up than girls on average. But certain assertive, clever girls in this hypothetical world we're speaking of will raise their hand and speak up before the next boy. Okay? So there are exceptions, but that doesn't invalidate the general finding. We also want to make the point that researchers don't base a theory on a single study. After the accumulation of a large body of evidence, many different studies on the same topic, we might begin to develop a theory of how genders differ in their interaction in a classroom setting. So the theory is based on the accumulation of many consistent findings, and in some cases, slight variations on that consistent finding that flesh out certain subparts of the theory. So the last thing I want to mention here, and it's not really clear on this slide, is that there's an interaction, that is an interplay, between research and theory. So theory can be developed and based on a bunch of findings, but then theory proposes hypotheses that generates new findings, and those new findings can either further support the theory or may lead to a revision of the theory. Now, I had said that science does a great job of moving beyond the mistakes of common or casual human inquiry. And that's true, but it is not the case that scientific inquiry about social behavior is completely unbiased. It is the case that each researcher brings his or her human values to the research context, and that can affect the research in obvious and less obvious kinds of ways. So we attempt to be objective, but we do have our own objectivity compromised somewhat by our values and interests. So we have to be careful of that, and that's part of what the peer review process is about. Some obvious influences on our research is the kinds of things that interest us as individuals are going to influence the kinds of topics that we choose to research. Some more subtle influences, things that aren't quite as obvious, are, as the researcher begins to interpret a pattern of behavior or relations between certain observed variables, that interpretation can be influenced by our research history, influenced by our expectations and values and preconceptions. Even stereotypes might influence how we interpret our data. And so those more subtle processes we have to be very careful of as scientists. And because it's not always flawless, not always perfect, it's very important that you are a critical consumer of research. As you read the information in this textbook and as you read studies in your research paper, be thinking, did this person do the research methods as well as they could? Did they make any mistakes or assumptions along the way? Is there another way to interpret this finding? That kind of thinking will help you grow as a potential researcher and also help you be cautious in assuming that all research conclusions are correct. So what are two general approaches or methods used? We mentioned this briefly in the first lecture. We have descriptive methods. Here's where we make systematic, careful observations, and we look at the way that behaviors are responsive to certain variables in the environment. Do people speak more loudly, for example, in a crowded room than in a less crowded room? We could measure the level of volume of individual speakers in a classroom setting with a few people or a lot of people and see what happens in that natural state. Is there an association between the number of people present and the volume at which people speak? We can also look at experimental methods. Here we attempt to manipulate certain aspects of the situation very carefully and also hold other aspects of the situation constant, and through a process of random assignment be able to determine a cause and effect relationship between certain variables. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But let's look at descriptive methods first. So with descriptive methods, we might have a variety of different approaches here, and some of these are mentioned on page 27 of your book. We have natural observations, surveys, psychological tests, archival studies, case studies. These are all careful observations and where there's no manipulation of behavior. And we can conclude about associations between things that we observe, but we can't really conclude any kind of cause and effect. So some advantages of the naturalistic observation is we can observe behavior as it unfolds naturally in its natural setting. The behaviors are spontaneous. If we do a good job of not being obtrusive, then people will behave without reacting to the presence of the observer. One of the benefits here is it doesn't rely on people's ability to or willingness to report on their own experiences. You can just kind of spy on them. Some disadvantages is the researcher may actually interfere with ongoing behavior. Imagine if you were sitting in a cafe and chatting with some friends, and then suddenly you notice that there was a person kind of standing off in the corner who kept staring at you and writing notes on a clipboard. My guess is you would suddenly start staring back at that person, and you might stop talking, and you might even move. So there, the spontaneous socializing behavior between you and your friends has been influenced by the presence of the researcher. Another thing is that some of the behaviors that a person might be interested in are very rare, and so if you're just kind of looking around waiting for them to occur in a natural setting, you may not actually see them, or it might take you a very long time to see them. So for example, I use human grooming here as a behavior that might be a little bit on the rare side, hard to observe in public, but nonetheless people engage in grooming behavior with one another. We see monkeys doing it all the time on National Geographic, on the Animal Planet, Discovery Channel, but human beings groom each other as well. I mean, I brush my daughter's hair, you might have a friend brush your hair, a friend might put makeup on you. I once watched two surfer guys, in their 20s, and one was picking the zits on the back of his friend there. And so that's all grooming behavior, but it doesn't happen very often. Another disadvantage is observer bias. A researcher may actually selectively attend to certain kind of behaviors that he or she is interested in and ignore others. And finally, this is a time-consuming method. It takes a lot of time to collect all that information. The survey method solves some of these problems. You've all taken surveys. This is where you're asked a bunch of questions about beliefs and behaviors, and you can capture some unusual or infrequent behaviors or things that people kind of keep a little private. So, you might not be caught in public picking your friend's zits, but you might admit to it on a survey if that question was asked, or another question like, do you ever pick your boogers and wipe it under a table? Well, maybe that might actually occur in the library, and it's ew, gross, but or put your gum under a table or something like that. But it might be something you would answer in a survey. Or sexuality. People might not be caught in public engaging in certain sexual acts, but would admit to it in a survey. Some disadvantages is that the people you choose to be in your survey or select to be in your survey may not actually represent the general population. And so there you might have that problem of overgeneralization. Like, well, we found this in the survey, but does it really apply to everyone? You also have the problem of social desirability bias. Even if you say a survey is anonymous, people may be concerned or worried that they might say something that's not very pleasant or not very politically correct, or might be ashamed of the behavior that they're admitting to. And so that kind of concern, that psychological reality, sometimes prevents people from being entirely honest with survey responses. And that's called social desirability bias. There are some ways to get around that, but we'll talk about that in a bit. Finally, we have psychological tests. Psychological tests are kind of like surveys, and there are a bunch of questions that are asked, but they're really focused more on specific characteristics of the individual. So a psychological test, for example, might measure intelligence, or might measure assertiveness, or a personality characteristic like extroversion. These very carefully designed measures do allow us to measure characteristics that are not easily observable from a person's momentary behavior, but are representing more consistent patterns over time and across situations. And they're important to understanding social behavior. Some disadvantages, and these are kind of silly disadvantages because hopefully you've chosen a good measure, a good test, but some of the tests can be less than fully reliable, and sometimes the test might be reliable but not be an especially good or accurate measure or valid measure of the thing that you're trying to measure. So you could have, for example, a measure of self-esteem, and when you actually look a little bit closer at it, it turns out to be a measure of pride. And that's a little bit different concept, and so the self-esteem measure would not be valid. So back to descriptive methods. Here, when we collect the information, we've made a number of observations of two or more variables. These are things that naturally vary in the environment and in individuals. And then we're able, through a statistical method, to assess the association or correlation between those two variables. And a correlation coefficient is just a mathematical expression of the strength of relationship between two variables. And it can range from a -1 all the way down to 0, and then all the way back up to +1. And they're most often expressed as a decimal, say -0.23 or +0.35. Those are just examples. And a negative correlation means that as one variable goes down, the other goes up, or vice versa. And a positive correlation means that the variables move together. So as one goes up, the other one goes up, or as one goes down, the other one goes down. So an example of a positive correlation, as we might say, is the temperature rises, beer sales also rise. So the hotter it gets, the more beer people drink, and the colder it gets, the less beer people drink. Okay, that would be a positive correlation. A negative correlation might be that the hotter it gets, the less clothes people wear. So one variable is going up, temperature, and the other variable, the number or amount of clothes people wear, goes down. So as the temperature goes up, 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 the shorts and bikinis appear, and the sweaters and stuff like that disappear. And as the temperature goes down, 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 the number and layers of clothes go up, up, up. And so we're down here at -20, and lo and behold, people are wearing 3 layers of clothes. So descriptive methods do give us information about correlation, but as you all know from other classes you've taken, we cannot say that when two variables are correlated, they are necessarily one causing the other. So what's an example of that? Ice cream sales are up on days when drowning incidents are highest. So, oh my gosh, that means that ice cream makes people drowned. Cause and effect. Well, maybe not. So here we have a little picture illustrating this. Variable A, ice cream, is seen to be associated with variable B, drownings. There's a positive correlation there. The more ice cream, the more drowning. Okay, so this could be that variable A could cause variable B. For example, eating ice cream could cause cramps, which could lead to drowning. Or maybe the causality could go the other way. Drowning caused more eating ice cream. Parents could say, oh, it's so sad, your friend Bobby died drowning. Here, have some ice cream to drown your sorrows. But often it's the case that a third variable is influencing both of the variables that appear to be correlated. So, for example, as the temperature goes up, people eat more ice cream, and as the temperature goes up, people do more swimming, which increases the chance of drowning. So a third variable is actually causing the other two variables to vary along with one another. Okay? Experimental methods, as I said, allows us to more carefully observe social behavior, and in that observation be able to make cause and effect conclusions about the relationship between variables. So we systematically manipulate one source of influence while ensuring that all other possibilities that could influence the behavior are held constant. So in an experimental approach, we have an independent variable. This is the variable that is manipulated, changed by the experimenter, the researcher, and the dependent variable that the researcher measures and has assumed or hypothesized will be changing along with the independent variable. As the independent variable is changed, the dependent variable, which is a response to that independent variable, or hypothesized response, will change also. That's the prediction. Social psychologists use two major types of experimental methods. We have laboratory experiments that have very careful control of the environment and all aspects of the environment. And some advantages of that is that we are very confident about cause and effect relationships because only the manipulated variable changes, and therefore in that environment that's carefully controlled, if there's a change in the dependent variable, the only thing that could have caused it is the variation in the independent variable. We also have, and some disadvantage of that, some people claim, is that the situation in the laboratory isn't very representative of the real world. And so it might be that we draw a conclusion about social variables in the laboratory, and then we say, well, when it gets out into the real world, it's not quite like the laboratory, so maybe that's not going to be the same in terms of the response. That's an issue of external validity that we'll talk more about in the course, and it's in your text. We also have field experiments. Now, field experiments may take the form of like a true experiment, like a laboratory, but just in a field setting. But the important qualification is that there is much less control of extraneous variables. The advantages are that it's like a real-life setting, and if we observe it occurring in a field experiment, we can feel pretty confident that we can generalize to other field or real-life experiences. Some disadvantages is that there's the lack of control over all aspects of the environment make the interpretation of the cause and effect somewhat more difficult. So part of what allows us to make cause and effect conclusions with experimental methods is random assignment. Random assignment is the practice of assigning participants to treatments so that each participant has an equal chance of being in any condition of the experiment. So what this really helps us with is mixing up in a random kind of way the personality influences that could be making a person respond differently to the experimental manipulation. So on the next slide we have kind of an illustration of this. This isn't in your textbook, but it is similar to some illustrations you might see in your textbook. So we have a bunch of people, different personalities, different values, different learning histories, different ages, etc. And there's just a mix of them in there. Now, if we didn't randomly assign them to these two different conditions, the experimental condition where they're going to view some violent TV in a controlled environment, or the control condition where they're going to view some non-violent TV in a controlled environment, and then the outcome measure or the dependent measure is how much aggression they engage in after they've watched either the violent TV or the non-violent TV. Now let's just say that there was in this group of people some grumpy, irritable people who just got in a fight with their roommate or had an argument with a coworker or something. They're all mixed in there with those people. Now, if we didn't do random assignment and we just sort of let people gravitate to whatever, they get to choose their own condition. Maybe those grumpy people go in the violent TV condition, maybe they don't. But the problem is that those differences in people may actually influence how they respond to that treatment and influence the way that they either are more or less aggressive. But with random assignment, we get a nice mix of grumpy and non-grumpy people, irritated and non-irritated people in each of the conditions in the experimental and control. So any variation as individuals gets kind of canceled or mixed in very well, and what we see in terms of the outcome measure is only the influence of the variation in treatment, violent TV or non-violent TV. Okay? So a last note about experimental methods before we go on. Some people criticize laboratory methods for failing to have mundane realism. Mundane realism is where you create an environment in the laboratory that appears normal or appears like the real world. So for example, if we were interested in, hey, is there a association, is there an impact of viewing violent TV programming on aggression between roommates or family members? Okay, so if we wanted to create mundane realism, we would create in our laboratory a living room setting that looked a lot like what an average person's household would look like. It would have a couch and some end tables and maybe a bowl of popcorn on the table, maybe some beers sitting around, and you got their TV, over there and you know, some socks on the floor, and that would be mundane realism. It would look like where people typically watch TV. Now, that might help us feel confident that if we observe that people are more aggressive with their roommates or fellow participants after watching some violent TV, well, that must happen in people's houses too. Well, experimental realism says, well, no, you don't need to make it look exactly like the settings in the real world, but the main thing is that you create a psychological experience like that in the real world. So as people are watching TV, they're equally attentive, they hear it at the same volume, they experience it psychologically in the same way that they might experience it at home. Okay, so you don't always have to have mundane realism. Experimental realism is enough. With experimental methods, we also have to talk about internal and external validity. To some extent, we've already been talking about external validity. This is the extent to which the results of an experiment can be generalized to other circumstances. So if we were to find, for example, that people who watch a lot of violent TV programming are a little bit more grumpy and you know, argue more with their roommates. Well, if we observed that in the laboratory and we felt confident that it could happen in dorm rooms and in family homes and in supermarkets where people are watching, or I'm sorry, in bars where people are watching a football game or something like that, that would be saying we have good external validity. We can generalize the results of this experiment to a number of other circumstances that are similar. Internal validity, and I know I've kind of gone in reverse here, but internal validity is the extent to which an experiment allows a confident statement about cause and effect. This means that when we conduct our experiment, we make our observations, and after the fact we analyze it and think, oh wow, we have more aggression in this condition than the other, so it must be the result, or this manipulation of violent versus nonviolent television is what caused differences in the degree of aggression that we observed. Now, a compromise to internal validity, it makes the internal validity a little bit questionable, is the idea of a confound. This is a variable, well, let's say first, it's a mistake that an experimenter made, a researcher made a mistake if they have a confound. And this is a variable that changes along with the independent variable in an unintended fashion. And so this could lead to a potentially misleading or mistaken conclusion about the independent variable. So back to our sample experiment, let's say that they're conducting this study where they manipulate whether a person's watching violent TV or nonviolent TV, and as they're conducting that study, there's a couple of things that kind of go wrong. In the violent TV programming condition, it just so happens that the room that they're conducting that study in also happens to have a thermostat that's broken. So it's really hot in there. It's like 105 degrees in there. Okay? And people watching the violent TV program are also kind of sweating and just feeling miserable. And also, let's say that the video playback system in that room, in that violent TV programming, is also kind of a little bit broken, and so it's like giving a fuzzy picture, and it's also hissing. It's like, and they're trying to hear the sound of the TV over that hissing sound, and it's also kind of hard to watch, and it's really hot in there. Now, over in the nonviolent TV program, the room's at a normal temperature, 70 degrees. The video playback is perfect, no annoying sound. If we find that there's a difference in aggression as a result of this study, we really can't be confident if it is because of the violent TV programming, or it's because they were really hot and they were really irritated by the noisy playback on the video playback. So that heat and that sound, extra sound, is a confound that kind of makes us a little bit less confident about the cause and effect relationship. Last thing I want to mention here before we wrap up this lecture is some issues in experimentation that have to do with the ethical treatment of research participants. According to the American Psychological Association and also with federal guidelines on human research, we need informed consent. A person has to have an agreement to participate in research only after they've been informed about the potential risks and his or her right to withdraw without any penalty. So you engage yourself in a research study, you should know in general detail what's going to happen to you as you participate, and you should also be told that you're not going to lose your extra credit or you're not going to lose your gift card or something like that if you decide that, hey, this study isn't for me, I'm not going to answer these survey questions, or this room is just too hot, I want to get out of here. Whatever it is, if you withdraw, you should be free to withdraw without any penalty. After the experiment is over, a participant is also entitled to a full debriefing, a discussion of what occurred in more detail, the hypotheses that the researcher was investigating, and also to address any potential subject reactions. So if afterwards people feel a little bit sad or feel angry or feel nauseous or whatever it is, the researcher has an obligation to explain how those reactions occur and also to help the participant feel back to normal. Finally, we have to evaluate the costs and benefits of research procedures. If the costs in terms of the psychological or physical experience of the research participant outweigh the potential benefits of the research procedures, then in that situation the research typically wouldn't be approved to go ahead. But most of the time, researchers see that there are benefits to learning about the social behavior that outweigh the potential inconvenience or uncomfortableness of the research participants. So the last slide for today is just to sort of briefly note that social psychology as a study of social behavior fits within a network of other subdisciplines of psychology. So for example, developmental, as we go through our lives from infancy on to death, and the whole range in between, youth, middle age, etc., our social behaviors change. And so that's part of a full understanding of social behaviors. How do infants interact with their family? How do coworkers interact with their coworkers and boss? How do the aged interact in an an old folks' home? Personality is very important. We've emphasized interaction of person characteristics with situation characteristics. So that's a critical subfield. Clinical psychology. Our social interactions are vital to our mental health, and so clinical psychology also is very important. Cognitive psychology, what we learn, how we remember it, what we focus on, what expectations from previous learning influence our social interaction is all very important. And finally, physiological psychology is becoming increasingly important. We're beginning to look at how hormones influence our behavior, how our brain chemistry interacts with our social interactions. So a lot of important interactions there. And that concludes our lecture for today. Thank you.